In the beginning of Hesiod's account, before the Titans had been named, and before the Olympians had been born, there was a list. It was a short list. It named the things that had come first, the entities that had appeared at the start of creation, not because anything made them, but because they were, in some sense, what creation was made of. Chaos was the first, then Gaia, the broad earth, the deep-breasted one, as Hesiod calls her, the stable foundation of everything that would ever stand on her surface. Then Eros, the force of desire, the oldest of the immortals, the one who loosens the limbs of gods and men. And then, in that same breath, that same ancient list, something else, something that was not made, and not born, and not fashioned from any prior material, but simply present, Tartarus, named alongside the earth and the oldest force of longing as one of the first things to exist, appearing in the first lines of the world's composition, the way a depth appears in a body of water, not as a separate feature, but as the quality of the water itself, discovered when anything falls into it and keeps falling. That quality, that depth, is what Hesiod is pointing at when he places Tartarus in his list of original things. Not a place that was constructed, not a pit that was dug, not a prison that was built for a particular purpose. Something older than purpose, older than the need for prisons, older than the gods who would one day use it as one. To be named in Hesiod's list of first things is to be granted a particular kind of age, not the age of something very old, but the age of something that predates the category of old, something that was there before time had a shape that allowed for words like before. And Tartarus was named there, present at the beginning, already deep. The word Hesiod uses for Tartarus in the Theogony is one he does not explain. He does not give Tartarus an origin story. He does not describe how it came to be or what it was doing before the world existed. He simply includes it in the list and moves on, the way a description of a landscape might include the sky, not because the sky requires justification, but because any honest description of the landscape must acknowledge what lies over it and beneath it. Tartarus is what lies beneath. It is not explained because it is the kind of thing that explains other things. It is the depth against which all other depths are measured. It is the bottom, and the bottom does not have a bottom. Gaia, the broad earth. Hesiod also treats as simultaneously a physical place and an entity capable of thought, desire, and action. She speaks, she plans, she allies herself with one side, and then another in the great conflicts of the early cosmos. She is the earth beneath the feet, and also a goddess who makes choices. The two aspects do not contradict each other in Hesiod's account. They inhabit the same name, the same being, without apology or explanation, because this is what the Theogony holds, that the oldest things in the cosmos are both the places where existence happens and the forces that make existence possible, that the earth is a goddess and the goddess is the earth, and both descriptions are complete. Tartarus is treated the same way. The pit is a place enormous and dark and structured, with walls and gates and a geography that other sources will map in detail. And Tartarus is also an entity, ancient and capable of reproduction, a force in the shaping of the cosmos, with its own distinct presence in the genealogy of the world. Neither aspect cancels the other. Both are simply held, the way a very old and complex thing often holds two qualities that would seem incompatible in something younger and smaller. To understand where Tartarus sits in the structure of the Greek cosmos, it helps to think of the world as Hesiod understood it, arranged in layers. In layers, the way stone is arranged in layers, each stratum below the last, each one separated from the one above it by an interval that is not merely spatial, but categorical. At the top layer, the surface of the living world, warm and lit, and populated by mortals going about their ordinary lives on the skin of Gaia. Below that, descending through the earth itself into something colder and less certain, the realm of Hades, the underworld where the dead resided, a country with its own geography, its own rivers, its own inhabitants, its own dim and particular quality of light, or of the absence of light. Not the deepest place, but the next place, the country immediately beneath the country of the living. And below that, as far beneath the realm of Hades as the realm of Hades is beneath the surface of the living world, Tartarus, the deepest stratum, the third level of a vertical cosmos, arranged not by whim, but by something like geological necessity, each layer exactly as far from the one above as that one is from the one above it, a repeating interval of inconceivable distance pressed downward into the dark. 3 layers: the living world, Hades, Tartarus, each one separated from the next by a distance that the mind, if it tries to inhabit it seriously, cannot quite close. And Hesiod, being a poet with an interest in making the inconceivable felt rather than simply stated, gives this vertical structure a specific and concrete measure. He takes a bronze anvil, he drops it from heaven, he drops it from heaven, he gives it 9 days and 9 nights to fall through open air until it strikes the surface of the earth. 9 full days of falling, the anvil dense and dark and moving downward through the sky at the pace that falling things move, the surface of the earth below it growing very gradually larger, the vault of heaven above it shrinking away, the anvil itself neither hurrying nor slowing, but simply falling, steady and continuous, for 9 complete days and their accompanying nights. That is the distance from heaven to earth. That is the first interval. Then Hesiod drops the anvil again. From the surface of the earth, through everything the earth contains, down through the realm of Hades with its gray and particular country, through whatever lies beneath that, through stone and darkness and increasing distance from the light, and the anvil falls again for 9 more days and 9 more nights before it arrives, finally at Tartarus, the same interval again, twice, once from heaven to earth, once from earth to Tartarus, the same 9 days, the same 9 nights, the same heavy, patient, undeflectable descent, and at the end of it, Tartarus, not a short distance below Hades, not a step down, a distance that takes 9 days to cross, even at the rate that a bronze anvil falls, which is to say a distance so large that it has to be measured in days rather than any unit of space, because the space itself exceeds the capacity of ordinary spatial thinking. What is worth holding in that image is not the strangeness of an anvil falling through the sky, though that is strange enough. What is worth holding is the patience of the interval. 9 days is not an instant. 9 days is time. It is time enough for hunger and thirst to make themselves known to any creature that experiences them. Time enough for the light to change 9 times from morning to noon to evening, for the stars to appear 9 times and retire 9 times, for sleep to come and go 9 times in the body of anyone watching the fall from below. The anvil falls through 9 days of ordinary time. The world goes about whatever the world was doing in those 9 days, and the anvil is still falling. The distance from heaven to earth is 9 days wide. The distance from earth to Tartarus is 9 days wide. The cosmos is built from an interval that is both enormous and somehow specific, not infinite, but 9 days, which is a number that admits of counting, that has an end, even if the end is very far away. That interval of 9 days appears elsewhere in the Greek mythological tradition, and its repetition there is worth noticing because it suggests that the number carries a particular weight in how these stories measure sacred or significant spans of time. Demeter wandered for 9 days when Persephone was taken from her, moving across the surface of the earth without eating or drinking or bathing, holding her torches, searching for her daughter, the grief of her wandering so complete that during those 9 days the crops of the living world withered and the earth grew cold. 9 days of a mother's grief measured against 9 days of a bronze anvil falling. The depth of Tartarus and the length of a particular sorrow hold the same dimension. Whether Hesiod intended this resonance deliberately, or whether it reflects something deeper in the way the Greek tradition shaped its measure of sacred time, the convergence is there. The interval that separates the abyss from the world above it is the same interval that separates the moment of loss from the first possibility of response. The anvil in Hesiod's account is made of bronze. This detail is not incidental. Bronze was the metal of the cosmos in a particular sense. The age of heroes was the Bronze Age. The gates of Tartarus, as other sources describe them, are made of bronze. The fence that surrounds the pit is made of bronze. The works of the divine forge that most concern the cosmos are bronze works. There is something in the material itself, in its density and its particular darkness, and the way it holds its weight, that makes it the right substance for this measurement. A bronze anvil is not a feather. It is not a leaf. It does not drift or waver in its descent. It falls with the complete commitment of something that knows exactly where it is going, without hesitation, without the possibility of catching the wind and going somewhere else. It falls true, and because it falls true, the 9 days it takes to reach the earth, and then the 9 more days it takes to reach Tartarus, are 9 days of something absolutely reliable. The measure is as honest as the material that makes it. There is a kind of rest available in following the anvil's descent. Not the rest of resolution, not the rest of a problem solved, but the rest of being inside something very large that is moving at a pace the mind can accompany without effort. The anvil falls, the days pass, the darkness deepens, and at the end of the second 9 days, somewhere far below the realm of the dead, and farther still below the surface of the living world, there is Tartarus. Already there, already what it was at the beginning of the list, not created by the anvil's arrival, not defined by what falls into it, simply present, the way depth is always simply present in anything deep enough to qualify as deep. Because Tartarus is on Hesiod's list, it does not require an origin story. This is the particular privilege of the things that appear at the beginning of the Theogony. They are not caused. Chaos is not caused. Gaia is not caused. Eros is not caused. And Tartarus 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 is not caused. They are the first things, and because they are the first things, they are the conditions under which all later things become possible. Tartarus is the condition under which the category of depth becomes possible. It is not a depth among depths. It is the depth from which the idea of depth proceeds. Every cave, every seafloor, every route going down through stone, every underground river moving through darkness, all of these are in some sense small instances of the thing that Tartarus is completely and originally. They point toward it, they approximate it, they carry a faint quality of what it is in full. But Tartarus itself is the original, the one that was present before there were any other depths to compare it to, the depth that appeared in the list alongside the broad earth and the oldest force of longing and preceded everything that would come after. In the centuries following Hesiod, the poets and mythographers who worked with the Theogony's framework returned again and again to the question of what Tartarus was, exactly, deity or place, entity or enclosure. The answer the tradition settled into, not all at once but gradually, over many generations of telling and retelling, was that Tartarus was both, and that the tension between the two aspects was not a problem requiring resolution, but a quality worth preserving. As Gaia was both the goddess and the earth, feeling and being felt simultaneously, so Tartarus was both the deity who would eventually act in the cosmic drama, and the physical abyss whose walls and gates and triple darkness other sources would map. The two aspects informed each other. The abyss had intention, the deity had depth, neither was fully intelligible without the other. What this dual nature allowed the tradition to do was give Tartarus a role in the genealogy of the cosmos that a mere place could not have played. A place cannot father children. A place cannot act as the generative force in the shaping of a new and terrible thing. But Tartarus understood as an entity, ancient, dark, present at the beginning, could, and in the Theogony, Hesiod records that Tartarus did exactly this. After the great war between the Olympians and the Titans, after the defeated Titans had been cast into the pit, and the bronze gates had been closed, and the cosmos had settled into its new arrangement, Gaia descended to the abyss and united with Tartarus. The two oldest forces of the earth, the surface and the depth, the mother of the living world and the abyss beneath the dead, came together in what Hesiod describes as a union from which Typhon was born. Typhon. The tradition holds him as the most terrible of all the monsters the ancient cosmos produced. Not one of the ordinary monsters of Greek mythology, the kind that heroes are sent to defeat and do defeat, the kind that occupy a specific cave or island or sea and trouble a specific region of the world. Typhon was something else, a force of cosmic disruption so complete that the gods themselves fled from him, taking animal shapes and running across the face of the earth before Zeus finally gathered enough power to face him. He was described in various ancient sources as reaching from the earth to the stars, as having 100 serpent heads each, with its own voice, as being the father of many of the monsters that would populate the mythology of the later world, the Hydra, the Nemean lion, the Sphinx, the Chimera. He was the last great threat to the order of the Olympian cosmos, the thing that had to be defeated before the world could settle into the shape it would hold for the rest of the mythological age. And he came from Tartarus. He was the child of the deepest abyss and the broad earth, the offspring of a union between the oldest darkness and the oldest ground. This is what makes Hesiod's genealogy of Tartarus remarkable. Not merely that the abyss was a place where things were imprisoned, though it was that too, but that the abyss was a generative force. Something was made there. Something came up from the bottom of the cosmos, fathered by the thing that was the bottom, and it came up enormous and terrible and full of the quality of what had made it. Typhon carried the depth with him. He carried the darkness. He carried the primordial quality of the thing that had existed since the beginning of the list, before the Titans, before the Olympians, before the world had a geography that could contain an ordinary monster. This is one of the stranger and more interesting aspects of how the Greek tradition understood the original darkness beneath the world, not as a place of pure negation, not as simply an absence of light and warmth and life, but as something with the capacity for generation. Tartarus could produce something. The abyss had a productive force, even if what it produced was a force of disruption, so severe that the gods could barely manage it. The deepest pit in the cosmos was not sterile. It held the Titans after their defeat. Yes, and it would hold the condemned souls of mortals who had transgressed in particular ways. But it also held, in some sense, a generative energy, the kind that came from being present at the beginning, from being one of the first things, from being so old that the world had been built around you, rather than you having been built into the world. After Typhon was defeated by Zeus, struck down with thunderbolts, and buried beneath a mountain, Etna in Sicily, according to several ancient sources, the volcanic mountain that the Greeks understood as the result of a monster buried but not quite extinguished, the cosmos found its final arrangement. The war against Typhon was the last major upheaval. After it, the gods were where they were, the underworld was where it was, the living world was on the surface, and Tartarus was at the bottom, very far below everything, as it had been since before any of this existed. Its role as prison had been established by the imprisonment of the Titans. Its role as source of cosmic threat had been demonstrated by the birth and near victory of Typhon, and its role as the foundational depth of the whole arrangement had been there from the beginning, from the moment it appeared in Hesiod's list of first things and took its place at the bottom of the vertical cosmos that would eventually become the world. The Theogony, composed around 700 BCE, is the primary text through which these details of Tartarus's primordial identity survive into the present. Hesiod was drawing on a tradition that was already ancient when he wrote oral traditions, hymns, local mythologies, variant accounts that had been accumulating for centuries before he arranged them into the form the Theogony takes. When he included Tartarus in his list of first things, he was not inventing this placement. He was recording a tradition that already held Tartarus as one of the original entities, already understood the abyss as something that did not require a maker, already measured the depth of the pit in the specific units of 9 days and a bronze anvil. The Theogony preserves these details, but it did not originate them. They were already there, in whatever form the tradition took before Hesiod, waiting to be written down. What the Theogony gives us, then, is not the beginning of the story of Tartarus, but a particular and carefully organized account of it, an account that places Tartarus in its proper cosmological relationship to everything else, that establishes its depth and its dual nature and its generative capacity, that situates it in the list of first things and then follows it forward through the genealogy of the cosmos until the world has the shape that Greek mythology will inhabit for the centuries that follow. Hesiod is not the first person to know about Tartarus. He is one of the first to write it down, and because he wrote it down, and because the Theogony survived, these details, the list, the anvil, the 9 days, Gaia and Tartarus, and the terrible child they made, are still here to be read and followed and sat with in the dark. The bronze anvil that Hesiod drops from heaven is in its way a perfect instrument for thinking about Tartarus, because it does what Tartarus does. It makes depth concrete. Tartarus is not an abstract concept in the Theogony. It is not a philosophical category or a metaphor for the depths of consciousness or the lowest point of human suffering, however useful those metaphors might be in later traditions. In Hesiod, Tartarus is a specific place with specific dimensions, and the anvil is the tool Hesiod uses to give those dimensions a form the mind can follow. The mind can follow a falling object. The mind can track something moving through space in a specific direction at a pace that admits of counting. 9 days, 9 nights. The sound the anvil would make if it struck the earth after 9 days of falling. The sound it would make when it struck the floor of Tartarus after 9 days more. Hesiod does not describe those sounds. But the anvil is moving through the poem, through the Theogony, through the centuries of transmission that brought it to the present, still falling, still crossing the second of its 9-day intervals, still approaching the thing at the bottom that was there before anything was. There is something quiet in that image, not ominous, not alarming, simply very large and very patient and older than almost anything that has ever tried to think about it. The cosmos of the theogony is built with this patience, the patience of 9 days of falling, the patience of an abyss that existed before there was anything to fall into it, the patience of an entity so old that it appears without explanation in the list of the first things and remains there, present and dark and enormously deep, while everything that would ever happen in Greek mythology happens above it. The Titans will fight and lose. The Olympians will settle into their dominions. The heroes will come and go. Odysseus will walk into the underworld and walk out again. Persephone will be taken and returned, and taken and returned. And through all of it, Tartarus will be exactly where it was in Hesiod's list, exactly as far below the realm of the dead as the realm of the dead is below the surface of the living world, neither closer nor farther, neither more nor less dark, neither more nor less ancient than it was at the beginning. The anvil is still falling. That is the image to hold, not the anvil falling from heaven to earth. That first 9 days is already finished in the account, already completed, already the established distance between the sky and the ground. But the second fall, the one that began when the anvil struck the surface of the earth and continued downward through stone and darkness and through the gray country of the dead towards something still lower, that fall is still happening in the poem. The anvil is moving through its second 9 days. The earth is above it, growing distant. Hades is around it, going past. The darkness is thickening, if darkness can thicken, the way night thickens in the early hours before dawn, when the absence of light seems to have accumulated rather than simply persisted. And somewhere at the end of this second interval, neither close nor particularly far in the logic of a fall that takes 9 days, Tartarus is waiting, present, primordial, already there, already what it was when Hesiod named it, in the same breath as Gaia and Eros, when the cosmos arranged itself around a darkness that required no arrangement, that had been the bottom before there was anything above it to be the bottom of. The anvil falls. The days of the second interval pass, each one complete, each one occupied with the ordinary contents of 9 days, the changing quality of the dark, the increasing distance from anything that could be called a surface. And the question that the image leaves open, the question that carries the listener gently forward without urgency or alarm, is simply this: how deep does a thing go before it finally arrives somewhere? The anvil knows. In 9 days, or some portion of them, it will know, and the knowing will be quiet and specific and so far below everything else that nothing from the surface of the living world will reach it, and nothing from the gray country of the dead will reach it, and it will simply rest in the bottom of the oldest depth in the cosmos, in the place that was there before the cosmos needed a bottom, in the dark that was present at the beginning of Hesiod's list, alongside the broad earth and the oldest force of longing, unchanged by everything that has happened since, unchanged by the anvil itself, unchanged by anything that has ever fallen into it, or been cast into it, or found its way down through the long, patient 9-day dark. Zeus and his siblings stood on Olympus in those early days without the thunderbolt. The outcome of the war was not settled. The Titans held Mount Othrys to the south, an older mountain than Olympus, occupied by an older generation of gods, and between the two peaks, the conflict had been running without resolution for years, that had already begun to feel like an age of the world. The tradition Hesiod records describes the war as lasting 10 full years. 10 years in which neither side could break the other. 10 years in which the cosmos remained suspended between one arrangement and another, with the question of which generation of gods would hold the sky and the sea and the rich earth entirely unresolved. The Titans had held the world before Zeus was born. They had made it in a certain shape, governed it according to their own understanding, and they did not intend to surrender it to the generation that had come after them. And Zeus and his siblings, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, Poseidon, and Hades, who had been swallowed by their father Cronus, and then disgorged one by one, when Cronus was tricked into drinking a mixture that forced him to give them back. These gods were newly free, newly gathered, and not yet equipped with the weapons that would change the war. The image Hesiod gives of those early years is of two mountains facing each other across a divide that could not be crossed by force alone. Othrys was the older stronghold, the mountain the Titans had held since the beginning of their rule, and from its slopes they could look north toward Olympus and see their adversaries assembling. Olympus was younger in the sense that its occupants had only recently arrived at it, had only recently been gathered from the different corners of the cosmos where they had begun their lives, and had not yet found the advantage that would end the war. The geography of the conflict was as fixed as the mountains themselves. Neither side moved the other, neither side fell. For 10 years the cosmos held its breath between them. What broke the stalemate was not a new strategy, but a descent. Zeus went down. The war would not be won from the summit of Olympus by the forces already gathered there. It would be won by going to the deepest available place in the cosmos and freeing what was imprisoned there. Before the Olympians could prevail, Zeus had to make the long journey downward, past the surface of the earth, past the gray ordinary darkness of the underworld, and further still into the region that existed so far below everything else that even the underworld was closer to the sky by comparison. He went to Tartarus, where the Cyclopes were being held. The Cyclopes, Brontes, Stropes, and Arges, whose names in the Greek tradition carry the sense of thunder, lightning flash, and brightness, had been imprisoned in Tartarus not by any act of Zeus or his siblings, but by Cronus, who had put them there long before the war began. Cronus had inherited from his own father Eranos a fear of being displaced by his children, and the Cyclopes, along with the Hecatoncheires, were among those whom Eranos had first confined, and whom Cronus had chosen to keep imprisoned rather than release when he came to power. They had been there in the deepest pit of the cosmos throughout the entire reign of the Titans, held in darkness at the bottom of everything, their particular gifts unused. Those gifts were specific. The Cyclopes in the Greek tradition were not the brutish solitary shepherds of the Odyssey. That figure is a different kind of Cyclops, a later creature bearing a family resemblance but a separate existence entirely. The Cyclopes whom Zeus descended to free were craftsmen. They were makers. They understood the materials of the world at a level of intimacy that no other figure in the tradition possesses, and what they could make from those materials was not ordinary work. When Zeus came down to Tartarus and broke their chains and led them upward out of the layered dark, they gave him, in gratitude, the weapon the tradition describes as the decisive gift of the entire war, the thunderbolt. The thunderbolt, as Hesiod's tradition holds it, is not simply a natural phenomenon borrowed for mythological use. It is a made object, a crafted thing, worked from materials that only the Cyclopes knew how to shape into that form. When it was placed in Zeus's hand for the first time, the war between the Titans and the Olympians became a different contest than it had been for the previous 10 years. The balance that had held the two sides in their stalemate, O3's facing Olympus across a decade of unresolved conflict was now tilted. Zeus had something the Titans could not answer, but the thunderbolt alone, decisive as it was, did not end the war. What ended the war was the second group that Zeus brought out of Tartarus, the Hecatoncheires, whose name in Greek means the 100-handed ones, are among the stranger figures in the tradition, and their strangeness is quite specific. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, 3 beings, each with 50 heads and 100 arms, imprisoned in Tartarus since before the age of the Titans, confined first by Aranos out of fear of their overwhelming physicality, then kept imprisoned by Cronus for the same reason. They had been in Tartarus a very long time, longer than the war, longer than the reign of the Titans. They had been there since near the beginning of things, and when Zeus descended to offer them their freedom, they accepted it with a gratitude that Hesiod describes as genuine and deep. The release of the Hecatoncheires required more than simply breaking chains. These were beings whose very existence made the gods who had imprisoned them feel uncertain, which is why both Aranos and Cronus had chosen confinement over any kind of alliance. Zeus approached them differently. Hesiod's account includes the detail that before asking anything of the Hecatoncheires, Zeus offered them nectar and ambrosia, the food and drink of the gods. And it is this act, this extending of divine nourishment to creatures who had been kept in the deepest pit of the cosmos and denied it, that precedes their willingness to fight. The Hecatoncheires were not conscripted. They were welcomed, and then they were led upward out of Tartarus, through the underworld, through the dark roots of the earth, and onto the surface of the world, where the war between the Titans and the Olympians was waiting for its resolution. There is something to sit with in the image of that journey upward. The Hecatoncheires had been confined below everything for longer than the war had been running, longer perhaps than any of the Olympians had been alive. 300 arms moving through the dark of Tartarus, through the triple-layered night that the tradition places around the pit, upward through the geography of the underworld, which even by itself is a place of considerable antiquity and depth, and then further upward still, until they emerged into a world where a war that had nothing to do with them had been stalled for a decade, waiting for exactly the kind of force they represented. The tradition does not describe what the surface of the world looked like to them after their long confinement, but the war did not last long after they arrived at it. What Hesiod describes in the final phase of the Titanomachy is an event of the kind that myths preserve when they want to convey that something decisive happened very quickly after a very long preparation. The 10 years of stalemate, the careful diplomatic descent to Tartarus, the freeing of the Cyclopes, the gift of the thunderbolt, the freeing of the Hecatoncheires, the long climb upward, all of this is the preparation. The battle itself is narrated with a different quality of speed. In the final engagement, the Hecatoncheires each lifted 300 boulders, 100 in each of their 100 arms, and hurled them simultaneously at the Titans. 300 boulders apiece from 3 separate beings is 900 boulders in total, all of them launched at once before any of the Titans could respond to the first. The tradition describes the sound and force of this as something the cosmos itself could feel. The earth shook, the sea responded, the sky, the wide arching sky that the Titans and Olympians had been contesting for 10 years, rang with the impact of what was happening beneath it. The language Hesiod uses for the final battle of the Titanomachy does not describe individual combatants or particular moments of contest. It describes something more like a total event, a simultaneous overwhelming, as though the war did not so much end through strategy as through the irresistible accumulation of everything that had been gathering toward this moment since Zeus first decided to go down to Tartarus and open what had been closed. The Titans fell. The tradition is clear that the defeat, when it came, was complete. There was no negotiation, no division of the cosmos that allowed the Titans to retain any portion of what they had held. The war ended in the way that wars in myth often end, not with a treaty, but with a transformation of the entire situation, so that the world that existed after the final battle was genuinely different from the world that had existed before it, shaped by the outcome in ways that could not be undone. The Titans who had stood on Othrys and held the sky for an age were now something else, the defeated and the confined. Zeus and his allies gathered the Titans after the battle. The process Hesiod describes is methodical rather than violent. The war's outcome was already determined, and what followed was not a continuation of the conflict, but the closing of it. The Titans were bound. The tradition specifies chains, which carries a particular weight in a mythological context, since chains in Greek myth are not simply restraints, but are often the work of divine craftsmanship, made to hold what ordinary confinement could not. The chains that bound the Titans were suited to the beings they bound, not ropes, not walls, not the kind of imprisonment that could be worked loose over time, but something specifically made for this purpose. They were taken down, the descent that Zeus had made at the beginning of the war's final phase, downward into Tartarus to free the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, was now made again in the other direction by the defeated Titans. The same distance that had separated Tartarus from the surface of the world when Zeus descended to broker his alliances was now the distance the Titans had to travel as prisoners. The tradition does not describe their experience of this journey. It describes the arrival, the Titans in Tartarus, behind the enormous bronze gates that would close on them and remain closed. The gates themselves deserve a moment of attention, because the tradition is specific about them in ways that suggest they matter as more than a narrative detail. Bronze features throughout the cosmological geography of Tartarus, the bronze wall or fence that Hesiod describes surrounding the pit, the bronze quality of the darkness, the bronze anvil that the tradition uses to measure the depth of the abyss, and the gates participate in this same material consistency. They are not wooden or iron. They are bronze, which in the world of Homer and Hesiod was the metal of the heroic age, the metal of weapons and armor, and the built things of gods. The gates of Tartarus are not a makeshift enclosure. They are a permanent cosmological feature, built to the scale of the beings they were meant to hold. Some ancient sources name Poseidon as the one who fitted these gates into their frame. The detail is interesting when set against everything else the tradition associates with Poseidon: his authority over the sea, his capacity to shake the earth, his governance of the deep places of the world beneath the water's surface. The god who holds dominion over the places that go far down was in this account the one who installed the boundaries of the deepest place of all. There is a kind of coherence in this. The foundational work of closing Tartarus was done by the god most associated with the deep structure of the world, the god whose realm extends downward rather than upward. Poseidon, at the gates of Tartarus, fitting bronze into bronze, completing the enclosure that the war had made necessary. This image places him at the threshold between the underworld of ordinary death and the far deeper prison that now held what the world had set aside. The Hecatoncheires did not return to their confinement in Tartarus once the war was over. Zeus stationed them as guards. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, the same beings who had been imprisoned in the pit for longer than anyone could easily calculate, who had been freed and fed and brought upward to end a war, were now assigned to stand at the gates of that same pit from the outside as its permanent guardians. This arrangement has its own quiet logic. If the Titans were too powerful for ordinary guards, then the appropriate guardians were beings who were more powerful still. The Hecaton chairs at their post outside the bronze gates of Tartarus are 100 armed, 50-headed answer to any question about whether the prison could be forced open from within. What the tradition preserves in this arrangement is not simply a security measure, but something more like a cosmological settling. The war was over, the world had been redistributed. The sky belonged to Zeus, the sea to Poseidon, the underworld to Hades, and beneath all three of those realms, beneath even the gray underworld where the ordinary dead arrived, Tartarus held what the new order had decided to hold there. The Hecaton Cheer is standing outside the bronze gates, century after century, were the living evidence that the settlement was real, that the new arrangement of the cosmos had been accomplished carefully and completely, with attention given to what must be kept in place for everything above it to remain stable. It is worth dwelling on what the 10-year stalemate means as a detail in the tradition. 10 years without resolution is a long time even in a mythological context, where events often proceed at the kind of speed that makes a single day sufficient to overturn the world. The Titanomachy did not overturn the world quickly. It settled into a grinding continuity, with Othrys and Olympus fixed in their opposition, and neither side able to break the other. The conflict required an intervention that came from outside the conflict itself, from below it, literally, from the place beneath the world where the imprisoned allies of the eventual victors were waiting without knowing they were waiting. Zeus's decision to go down rather than press forward was the decision that ended the war, and it is a decision the tradition narrates with considerable care. There is a particular quality to the relationship between Zeus and the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires that the tradition establishes before the battle. He went to them, he fed them, he freed them without asking them to commit to anything first. The gratitude that followed, the thunderbolt given freely by the Cyclopes, the willingness of the Hecatoncheires to fight, reads in the tradition as a genuine response to a genuine gesture rather than a transaction. The beings who had been left in Tartarus by previous rulers, kept there out of fear and distrust, were offered something different by the new generation, and what they gave in return broke a 10-year stalemate in the time it takes to hurl a mountain's worth of stone. The defeated Titans inside Tartarus form a particular category in the tradition. They are not the dead. They are not condemned souls being punished for crimes committed during their lives. They are the previous rulers of the cosmos, imprisoned because they lost a war, held in a place that was built to hold them rather than in any place associated with ordinary human death and judgment. The Titans in Tartarus are a cosmological necessity, the thing the new order required to be contained so that the new order could exist at all. This is different from punishment in the way it is usually understood. The confinement of the Titans is not a moral judgment so much as a structural one. The cosmos that Zeus rules cannot coexist with the cosmos the Titans ruled, and the bronze gates of Tartarus are the boundary between one and the other. The two mountain peaks that faced each other for 10 years, Othrys to the south, Olympus to the north, are still there, in the geography of Greece, in the physical world that exists beneath the sky. The tradition says Zeus now holds. Olympus still reaches higher than any other mountain on the Greek mainland. Othrys still stands in Thessaly, lower than its rival, the mountain that the defeated generation had held. The tradition placed its most consequential conflict in the geography of an actual landscape, giving the 10 years of war a physical residue that could be seen and stood upon, long after the war's outcome had settled into permanence, and Tartarus is below all of it, below the surface of the earth where those mountains stand, below the roots that reach down through stone and darkness, below the ordinary underworld that receives the dead of every generation. Tartarus is there, with its bronze gates and its triple night and its hecaton chairs at their post, holding what was put inside it after the war that changed the shape of the cosmos. The gates that Poseidon fitted into their frame have not been opened. The chains that bound the Titans were made to last. The three guardians outside the doors have all of their 100 arms and all of their 50 heads, and they have been standing at that threshold since the day the last of the Titans was led inside, and the doors were closed behind them. The world went quiet after 10 years of war. That is the quality Hesiod's tradition gives to the aftermath, not triumph, not celebration, but a vast and settled quiet, the kind of silence that follows something enormous when the enormous thing has finally finished. The cosmos that had been suspended between two arrangements was now in one arrangement, and the arrangement was secured from the bottom up, with the deepest available confinement holding the previous order in place, so that the new one could proceed. The air above the mountains was still. The sea that Poseidon now governed lay over the deep roots of the earth without disturbance. The sky held the light that Zeus now directed from Olympus. And beneath all of it, at the bottom of the layered world, the bronze gates of Tartarus stood in their frame, the hecaton chairs outside them, the Titans inside, and the enormous inconceivable distance between the surface of the world and the pit's floor still measuring itself in the kind of time it takes a very heavy thing to fall a very long way through the dark. There is something quietly remarkable in the way the tradition handles the relationship between the freedom of the hecaton chairs and the confinement of the Titans. The same pit held both groups before the war ended. The hecaton chairs had been there alongside the Cyclopes, all of them prisoners of an older order that feared what it could not control. When Zeus opened Tartarus to take them out, the pit was not yet the prison of the defeated. It was simply the deepest place, the place where the powerful kept whatever they wanted to keep, beyond reach. What changed was not the pit itself, but what it was used for. After the war, Tartarus became something more specific, the place where the war's outcome was maintained, where the bronze gates held the boundary between the age that ended and the age that began. Poseidon pressing the bronze doors into their frame is an image of that transformation. The god of the deep places of the world, whose authority extends downward through water and stone and the shaking earth, was the one who completed the architectural work of the new order's foundation. The gates he set in place did not simply close a pit. They closed a chapter of the world's history, and the closing was meant to be permanent. What was inside would remain inside. What was outside would proceed without it. The chain of events that had started with Zeus's siblings, swallowed by Cronus, that had moved through the long years of Zeus's preparation and the 10 years of the stalled war, that had required the descent to Tartarus and the gifts of the Cyclopes and the 300 arms of the Hecatonuries, all of it culminated in the sound of bronze meeting bronze as the gates of the deepest pit in the world settled into their closed position. And then there was quiet. The kind of quiet that the tradition holds is appropriate after something very large has finished. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of completion, the world in the arrangement that all of the events had been moving toward. Othries, silent on its southern slopes, Olympus holding its height above everything beneath it, and Tartarus below everything, sealed and guarded and immeasurably deep, a door of inconceivable size, gently and permanently closed. The bronze fence of Tartarus appears in Hesiod's Theogony, not as a grand or imposing structure, but simply as a fact, something encountered at an enormous distance below everything else, present in the darkness at the very bottom of the world's arrangement, as unremarkable in its way as the walls of any very old building that has been standing long enough to seem like it was always there. It is cold to the touch in the way that metal deep underground is always cold. It has been there since before almost anything else existed, and standing before it in the account Hesiod gives, the quality it carries is not threat, but simply age, the particular kind of age that belongs to things which have never needed to explain themselves to anyone. This is the boundary Hesiod draws around Tartarus. Not stone, not earth, not the natural walls of a pit sunk into the ground, but bronze, worked metal, shaped and fitted, a construction that implies intention and permanence. The choice of bronze is not incidental. In the Greek tradition, bronze was the material of the heroic age, heavy and authoritative, carrying the specific gravity of things that were meant to last. That the boundary of the deepest place in the cosmos is made from this same material gives Tartarus a quality that a simple void would not have. It is not an emptiness, it is an enclosure, and the distinction matters because what is enclosed is enormous. Beyond the bronze fence, the darkness deepens. Hesiod describes what lies over Tartarus as a triple layer of night, not ordinary night, the kind that follows day and gives way to morning, but something older and more structural than that, a cosmological feature rather than a meteorological one. 3 complete layers of night, each one entire in itself, stacked over the pit and over its bronze walls, and over the darkness that already fills the space between the walls and whatever lies at the center of them. The first layer is dark. The second is darker in the way that the deep earth beneath the soil is darker than the surface soil itself, a darkness that has never been touched by light from above and has no expectation of it. The third is a darkness so complete that it functions less like the absence of light than like the presence of something else, a positive quality, a feature of the place rather than a lack of illumination. 3 layers of night as a cosmological barrier. The image Hesiod offers here has the quality of geological strata, the way a cross-section of deep stone shows its own history in horizontal bands, each layer deposited over the one below it, over an expanse of time that the mind can acknowledge but not really hold. The triple night of Tartarus works in the same way, except that it was not deposited over time, but was simply part of the arrangement from the beginning, a feature of the deep cosmos that predates almost everything. Below the third layer, Tartarus waits in its bronze enclosure, old and still, and entirely itself. The rivers of the underworld reach even here, or begin here, depending on which ancient account is followed. The Styx, the river of unbreakable oaths, the river by which the gods of Olympus swore their most serious vows, is described by Hesiod as having its source somewhere in the deep regions below, branching upward from the abyss through the underworld toward the world above. The direction of that flow is worth pausing on. Most rivers begin in high places and move downward. The Styx in Hesiod's account begins at the bottom of the cosmos and moves up through the layers toward the surface, carrying with it the cold authority of whatever is oldest and most foundational. A god who swore by the Styx was drawing on the deepest available source of binding power, reaching all the way down through the layers of the underworld to whatever it was that the Styx carried from its origin in the abyss. The Phlegethon is another river of the underworld regions, associated with fire in a way that might seem unexpected, so deep below the earth, but which makes its own kind of sense when the underworld is understood as a place with its own geography rather than simply a darkness. Fire and river together, heat moving in the direction that cold water moves, the underground world more complex and more various in its terrain than the simple image of a pit would suggest. Ancient sources describe these rivers as features of the landscape through which the dead must orient themselves, waterways that mark the boundaries between different regions of the world below. Near the deep regions where Tartarus presses upward through the underworld's lowest levels, the phlegethon runs with its own cold light, a different kind of illumination than anything available above. The Cocytus, the river of lamentation, is the third of the great underworld rivers. Its name in Greek carries the sound of grief. The word for weeping is embedded in it, so that the river announces its nature in its name. It runs through the lower regions in Hesiod and in the poets who came after him, its waters carrying the particular quality of long-held sorrow, the kind that belongs not to a single moment of loss, but to the condition of having lost something irreversibly and being with that loss for a very long time. The Cocytus, like the others, is a geographical feature of the underworld landscape, a river to be crossed or followed or avoided, with banks and a current, and the specific character that ancient sources gave it. That its character is grief is simply a fact about that part of the world, the way that certain valleys in the living world have their own quality of shadow or cold that has nothing to do with the time of day. These three rivers, the Styx, the Phlegethon, the Cocytus, together describe an underworld that is neither empty nor undifferentiated, but arranged, featured, traversable. They give the regions below the earth a kind of internal coherence. The world the living inhabit has its mountains and plains, its rivers and coasts, its zones of heat and cold. The world below has its own equivalent arrangement, its own cartography, though the map would be drawn in different colors and with different landmarks. Tartarus occupies the deepest point on that map, so deep that even the underworld itself is not close to it, positioned as far below the realm of Hades as Hades is below the sunlit surface of the living world. The distance is not casual. The tradition held it as a real measurement of real cosmic space, as serious and precise in its way as any measurement applied to the world above. An anvil dropped from the vault of heaven falls 9 days before it reaches the earth. The same anvil dropped from the surface of the earth falls another 9 days through the dark before it reaches Tartarus. 3 zones of existence, each separated from the next by a span of 9 days, and between the realm of Hades and the pit of Tartarus, that second descent of 9 days presses downward through the layers of night, through the underground dark, through the geological stillness of the deep earth, until finally it reaches the place marked by its bronze fence, and its triple darkness, and its rivers rising upward toward a light they have never seen. At the gates of that place, stationed since the end of the great war that settled the cosmos into its present arrangement, stand Cottus and Briareus and Gyges, the hecaton chairs, the 100-handed ones, each of them carrying 50 heads and 100 arms. The number is exact in Hesiod's account, and exactness matters here. These are not vaguely enormous figures of the kind that mythology sometimes produces. They are specifically described, 50 heads, each one a separate seat of perception, 100 arms, each one capable of independent action. Before the Titanomachy ended, they were imprisoned in Tartarus by Cronus, consigned to the deep pit that would later bear the Titans themselves. In the final phase of the war, they were released and given food and drink, and the first kindness they had known since before their imprisonment. They entered the battle and ended it, hurling 300 boulders simultaneously, a number that is only possible if each of their 100 hands is holding something, and then, when the war was over and the Titans were sealed inside, they remained. Cottus, Briareus, Gyges, their names appear in Hesiod's Theogony with a specificity that has the quality of a formal record. They were stationed at the gates of Tartarus not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent arrangement, their 100 arms suited by nature to the task of holding a boundary that nothing should cross. Century after century, the tradition holds them there in their positions, unmoving in any account that describes the cosmos as it settled into its present form. They did not age. They did not sleep in the way that mortal guards must sleep, leaving their post unattended in the deep watches of the night. They simply remained at the gates, their 50 heads apiece turned toward the bronze doors, the darkness around them, absolute and familiar and exactly as it had always been. The image of the hecaton chairs at their post is one of the most particular in all the ancient material about Tartarus, not because they are menacing, though their physical description has a quality of overwhelming scale, but because their presence there gives the gates a kind of weight and specificity that a simple description of locked doors would not have. The bronze doors are locked, and before the bronze doors stand 3 beings of incalculable physical capability, each one with 100 arms that have already, collectively, ended a war. There is a thoroughness to this arrangement that feels less like cruelty than like engineering, the careful matching of a problem with exactly the right solution, the cosmos organized with the quiet precision of something that has had a very long time to get its details right. Those bronze doors. Poseidon, in some ancient accounts, had a hand in their construction or their installation. Poseidon, the god whose domain is the sea and the shaking earth, whose authority extends into the deep foundations of things. The connection is not incidental. Poseidon is associated in the Greek tradition with the forces that move beneath the surface of the world, with the trembling of the ground that signals enormous underground energy, with the deep architecture of the earth rather than its surface features. That such a god would be involved in fitting bronze doors into the frame of the world's deepest prison suggests that the work required someone with a feel for what lies under things, for the structural demands of a foundation that must hold against whatever pushes against it from below. The doors he fitted were meant to stay. They are still there, in the tradition's understanding of the world. Bronze against the dark, sealed, with the weight of Poseidon's specific authority pressing them into their frame. The bronze fence, the triple night, the rivers rising from the abyss, the hecaton cherries at their post, the bronze gates pressed into place by a god of deep foundations. Tartarus, as Hesiod and the ancient sources describe it, is an accumulation of specific architectural features, each one serving a function, each one appropriate to its place. And underneath all of these features, at the very bottom of the account, there is something else, something that gives the whole structure a different quality than a simple prison or a geographical feature of the underworld would have. Hesiod's Theogony describes the roots of the earth and the sea as originating in or connecting downward to Tartarus. The roots of the earth. The word invites a particular image, something like the root system of a very large tree pressing downward through the soil and rock and branching filaments, anchoring the structure above to the ground below. In Hesiod's cosmology, the earth itself is similarly anchored, its roots reaching through the geological layers, through the underworld, through the dark below the underworld, until they terminate somewhere in Tartarus. The sea has roots in the same deep place. Everything that constitutes the surface of the world, every living thing, and every geological formation, and every body of water, all of it connected downward through the layers to the pit at the bottom of the cosmos. This reframes Tartarus entirely. A pit at the bottom of the world, sealed with bronze and surrounded by triple darkness, is one thing, an interesting cosmological feature, a place where things are kept. But a pit at the bottom of the world, from which the roots of the earth extend upward to support everything above it, is something different. It is not only a prison, it is a foundation. The surface of the living world, warm and sunbright and various in its terrain, is held up from below by something it cannot see and has no ordinary means of knowing about. A darkness so deep and so far beneath it that the interval cannot be measured in anything smaller than days. The crops growing in the fields of the living world, the mountains of Olympus and Athras, the floor of the sea, all of them grounded, ultimately, in Tartarus. This is not a detail that the tradition treated as ironic or troubling. It was simply the structure of the world as Hesiod described it, the vertical arrangement of the cosmos laid out from the bright surface down through the gray middle regions and onto the deep dark below, that the deepest thing should also be the most structurally significant, is consistent with a cosmological sensibility that takes depth seriously as a category, that values what is oldest and most foundational rather than what is newest and most visible. Tartarus is at the bottom, and because it is at the bottom, everything rests on it. The rivers know this. The Styx, rising from somewhere near the deep abyss, carries upward into the world of the dead something that it gathered from the lowest place available, the specific binding authority of the deep cosmos, the oath-sealing power that comes from making contact with the foundation of everything. When the gods swear by the Styx, they are invoking the most structurally essential thing in the cosmos, reaching all the way down through the layers to the place where the roots of the world begin. An oath sealed with that reference cannot be unmade, because the thing it references cannot be moved or altered or replaced. Tartarus holds the world up from below. The Styx carries that holding authority upward through the world, available for the most serious purposes. There is also the question of what is generated in Tartarus, not merely contained within it. The tradition holds that Gaia, the earth, whose surface is the living world itself, united with Tartarus after the defeat of the Titans to conceive Typhon, described by Hesiod as the most terrible of all monsters, the last great threat to the Olympian order, a being so extreme in its nature that the gods fled before it, the surface of the world and the deepest abyss beneath it, two of the oldest forces in existence, coming together to produce something new from the deepest available darkness. Tartarus, in this account, is not only a foundation or a prison, but a generative force capable of participating in the making of something that could not have been made anywhere else. What comes from the deepest place has the quality of the deepest place, enormous, ancient, shaped by a pressure and a darkness that has existed since before the world was arranged into its present form. Typhon would eventually be defeated, sealed under a mountain by Zeus in most accounts, the last great disruption of the settled Olympian cosmos, driven back and contained. But the fact of his origin remains in the tradition as a reminder that Tartarus is not simply passive. It holds what has been consigned to it, and it exerts its own quality on whatever comes near it, and when the conditions were right, it produced, in collaboration with the oldest earth, something that nearly unmade the world above. The foundation is generative. The abyss is not empty. The bronze walls that Hesiod describes around Tartarus appear in his account as surrounding not merely the pit, but the whole of the deep cosmological space, the fence marking off the region of Tartarus from the even further darkness of the surrounding abyss. The space that lies beyond Tartarus in every direction, deeper than the deepest place, the unstructured void that exists outside the arranged cosmos altogether. The bronze fence in this reading is a cosmological boundary as much as a structural one, a line between the deep but arranged space of Tartarus and the entirely unarranged void beyond it. Tartarus is inside the cosmos, at its lowest point, while the darkness beyond the bronze fence is outside it entirely, belonging to no category that the living world, or the underworld, or even Tartarus can account for. This is the detail that makes the triple night comprehensible as more than a simple intensification of darkness. The 3 layers of night over Tartarus are not merely deep night, in the way that a moonless, overcast night is deeper than a clear one. They are different orders of darkness, each one a further remove from any light that has ever existed anywhere in the arranged cosmos. The first layer is the darkness of the deep earth, familiar to miners and roots and the buried dead. The second is the darkness of the space below the earth, the region that the Greek tradition called the Underworld, where gray light filters through without source or direction. The third is the darkness that borders the void, the outermost edge of the structured world, a darkness that is also a threshold. Below it, the bronze fence, and below the bronze fence, Tartarus, and beyond the bronze fence in every other direction, the abyss that has no structure at all. Hesiod describes this with the specificity of a geographer rather than a poet, or rather with a specificity that does not yet distinguish between those two things, because in the tradition he is drawing from, cosmological geography and mythological narrative were the same inquiry. Where does the world go at its edges and its bottom? What is there? What is it made of? How was it arranged? These are the questions that the Theogony answers, and Tartarus is one of the answers, a specific and structural one, with walls and guardians and rivers and roots, and the weight of everything above it pressing down through the layers. The silence of Tartarus in all these descriptions is absolute, not the silence of a quiet afternoon or an empty room, but the silence that belongs to places so far removed from any source of sound that even the concept of sound begins to seem contiguous with the brighter world above. The hecatonchires at the gates do not speak in any account that describes them at their post. The rivers move through the dark in their particular ways, the Styx cold and purposeful, the Phlegon carrying its own light, the Cocytus running with its long accumulated grief. But rivers are slow and their sound is low, and in the depth of Tartarus, even that low sound disperses into the surrounding dark before it travels far. The bronze walls absorb whatever reaches them. The triple night absorbs whatever the bronze walls do not. The roots of the earth reach down through all of this in silence, through the living world's soil and rock, through the gray regions of the dead, through the darkness of the deep underworld, through the 3 layers of night, through the space between the surface of the world and the bronze fence that marks the beginning of Tartarus, and then down into Tartarus itself, where they terminate in the deepest available ground, anchoring the whole vertical arrangement of the cosmos to the oldest and most foundational thing in it. Whatever moves in the living world, whatever grows and shifts and changes in the warm light above, all of it is held at its deepest structural level by something ancient and dark and entirely still. This is the particular quality of Tartarus, as the ancient sources describe it, not a place of activity or drama, not a stage for the working out of divine conflict or mortal suffering, not primarily, but a structure, the deepest structure of the world, the foundation beneath the foundation, the element without which the arrangement of everything else would have nothing to rest on. The bronze fence marks its boundary. The triple night describes its depth. The hecatoncheires guard its gates with their combined weight of 300 arms and 150 heads turned permanently toward the doors. The Styx rises from somewhere near its floor and carries its foundational authority upward into every oath sworn by every god who has ever needed to bind a promise to the most serious possible anchor, and the roots, the living earth, from its warm and sun-touched surface all the way down through its own body, reaches into this place and holds on. The sea, with its vast cold floor, connects downward through whatever lies beneath the seafloor and finds its structural ground in the same deep place. A world resting on something it cannot see, anchored in a darkness 3 layers deep, behind a bronze fence that has been standing since before the Titans were sealed and the Olympians took their places above. The foundation is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply holds. The distance between the surface of the living world and Tartarus, those 18 days of the falling anvil, taken together, 9 to reach the earth and 9 more to reach the pit below, is not really a distance that invites the imagination to picture the journey. It is too large for that. What it invites instead is something more like the acknowledgement of scale, the same quiet adjustment that happens when the mind encounters the age of a mountain or the depth of the ocean, a moment of recalibration rather than a failure of comprehension. The cosmos is arranged vertically in the Greek understanding, with the bright world at the top and the deep dark at the bottom, and the interval between them is so large that the 9 days of a falling anvil measures only half of it. To know that is not to understand the distance fully. It is simply to be in the right relationship with it, smaller than it, and aware of being smaller, and finding that awareness quietly interesting rather than troubling. This is the scale at which Tartarus operates. Not human scale, not even the scale of the Olympians whose world is immediately above the gray middle regions of the dead, but the scale of the cosmos itself, the scale at which the roots of the earth and sea make sense as structural features rather than metaphors. The world is very large, and it rests on something, and that something is very deep and very old, and surrounded by bronze and triple night, and the steady presence of 100-handed guard that has been standing there since the war that settled the cosmos into its current arrangement, ended, and the gates were fitted and sealed. Below the second layer of night, and then below the third, below the bronze fence, and through the depth of Tartarus itself, the roots extend. They have been there longer than the Titans, longer than the Olympians, longer than the war that imprisoned the one and elevated the other. They were there when Tartarus first emerged as one of the original entities present at the beginning of the cosmos alongside Gaia and Eros and the first arrangement of things. And they will be there in the tradition's understanding, for as long as the world above them remains the world, warm and various, and sun-bright, growing things and holding them, arranged in its layers from the surface of the earth down to the gray middle regions and on to the deep dark below, all of it resting, at the last and most foundational level, on the ancient bronze-fenced dark of Tartarus, which is holding the world up from below, quietly, without announcement, as it has always done. The roots of the earth go down through every layer of the cosmos and arrive, finally, in the deepest available ground. The bronze fence is very old and very still. The triple night sits over it in its 3 complete and separate darknesses, each one a geological stratum of the deep cosmos, each one entire and unmoved. The hecatoncheires stand at the gates with their 100 arms at rest and their 50 heads apiece turned toward the doors, the centuries moving through them like weather moves through stone. And the world above all of this, The world of growing things and daylight and the ordinary living distance between one place and another hangs above Tartarus the way a tree hangs above its roots, held in place by something so deep and so far below that no amount of looking downward through the soil and rock and gray underworld dark would ever bring it into view. It is simply there at the bottom of the arrangement. It holds. The world rests on it, as the world has always rested on it, and goes about its surface business in the warm light above, without knowing, in the ordinary run of things, what is holding it. In the underworld, as Homer tells it, Odysseus stands at the edge of the dark and watches. He has dug a trench and poured libations and stepped back, and now the dead are coming toward him from every direction, pressing through the dimness like shapes remembered rather than seen. Among them, at some distance from the others, is a figure standing in water. The water is clear. It reaches to the figure's chin. Above him, branches hang low and heavy with fruit, figs and pears, and pomegranates swollen with seed, and apples bright as copper in the half-light. The branches bowed down by their own weight, close enough that a standing man could reach them without effort. The figure beneath them is reaching. His hand extends upward through the still air of the underworld. His fingers spread, and the fruit is right there, almost close enough to touch. Then the branch lifts. It rises slowly by exactly the distance required to remain out of reach, and the hand closes on nothing. This is Tantalus. His name, in the oldest Greek sources, is given as that of a mortal king, a son of Zeus himself, a man who had been given something almost no mortal ever received, a place at the table of the gods on Olympus, where the food was ambrosia and the air smelled of something that had no name in the language of the living. He had been admitted to the company of immortals, and he had done something with that admission that the tradition finds almost impossible to speak of plainly. He had taken his own son, a boy named Pelops, and he had killed him and cooked him and served him as a meal to the gods at his table. The sources differ on what he intended by it. Some hold that he was testing the omniscience of the gods, performing the most extreme act conceivable to see whether they would know. Others suggest something closer to a darkened version of hospitality, as though the man had looked at the most sacred obligation of his world, the obligation to feed and protect a guest, and had enacted it with a horror that turned it inside out. The gods, for their part, did not eat. Demeter alone, distracted by grief for her daughter, ate a piece of the shoulder before realizing what it was. The rest withdrew from the table. Zeus restored Pelops, fashioning him a new shoulder from ivory, and sent him back among the living. Tantalus was given Tartarus. What he found there was a pool and a tree, and the precision of the arrangement is the thing worth dwelling on. The tradition did not simply put Tantalus in darkness, or subject him to pain, or assign him a labor. It surrounded him with exactly the two things a banquet requires, something to drink and something to eat, and made them perpetually, carefully inaccessible. The water around him is not shallow. It rises to his chin. It is cold and clear and entirely real. When he bends his head toward it, it retreats, pulling back below the level of his lips, drawn down by something the tradition does not explain, leaving only damp earth and then dry stone where the surface had been. When he straightens again, the water returns, rising back to its original depth, lapping at his jaw, perfectly present and perfectly useless. The branches above him follow their own rhythm. They do not snap upward. They do not vanish. They lift with the slow, unhurried patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time and has settled into the work. Each time Tantalus reaches, the branch rises by the specific distance required to keep the fruit out of contact with his fingers. not dramatically, not with any appearance of malice, but with the calm mechanical precision of a punishment that knows exactly what it is. The fruit itself remains intact. It does not rot. It does not fall. It hangs in its impossible abundance directly above a man who was once given everything, and it will hang there indefinitely because that is the structure of the story. The Greek word that the tradition eventually extracted from his name was the verb for this precise experience, the experience of seeing what is needed and finding it perpetually just beyond the grasp of the person who needs it. The English language inherited that word and uses it still. When something is tantalizingly close, the original image is this one: a man in a pool with fruit overhead, in the dark below the world, stretching his hand towards something that moves. To stand beside that pool in imagination, the way Odysseus stood beside it, is to notice that the punishment has an internal geometry. Tantalus committed an act of grotesque excess at a table. He was placed at a table from which nothing can be taken. The crime involved food prepared for gods who did not ask for it. The sentence involves food withheld from a man who cannot stop wanting it. There is something in the design that feels less like arbitrary cruelty and more like a mirror, an image turned back on itself until it occupies both sides of the same surface, the act and its echo arranged in perfect permanent opposition. The pool in Tartarus where Tantalus stands is very still most of the time. The only movement is the retreat of the water when he bends, and its return when he straightens, and the slow rise of the branches when his arm goes up. Otherwise, nothing moves. The underworld around him is quiet. The bronze walls are at some distance. The darkness is the layered darkness of a place that has never had light of any kind, and Tantalus stands in the middle of it, surrounded by abundance, in a hunger and a thirst that the tradition describes as permanent and total, and that the listener encounters from a great distance, the distance of Homer's text, and of Odysseus's position at the trench, and of all the centuries between the composition of the Odyssey and the room where someone lies in the dark, following the old story, slowly toward sleep. Further from the pool, somewhere in the wide geography of Tartarus, there is a hill. The hill is steep. Near its summit, not at its summit, but near it, close enough that the summit is visible from the right angle, close enough to seem almost reached, a boulder rests for just a moment on the slope. The moment is very brief. The boulder does not stay. It rolls back, and the man who pushed it up the slope watches it go, and then he begins again. Homer describes this scene directly in the 11th book of the Odyssey. Odysseus, still standing at the edge of the underworld, with his trench and his dark pool of libation, sees Sisyphus at his labor. He sees the enormous stone. He sees the man straining with it, his whole body bent into the work, his hands against the rough surface, his feet finding purchase on the slope. He sees the stone rising. He sees it approach the summit, and then the heavy stone, as Homer writes it, goes rolling back down to the plain. Sisyphus, in the tradition, was a king, the king of Ephyra, which later sources would identify with Corinth. He was known across multiple sources for being the cleverest of men. The tradition accumulates his crimes across several tellings, and they are crimes of a particular kind, crimes against the boundary between life and death, committed by someone who found that boundary less binding than it was supposed to be. The first was the chaining of Thanatos, death himself, the god, the personification of the thing that takes the living away. Sisyphus caught him, the sources hold, and bound him in chains, and while Thanatos remained chained, no mortal anywhere in the world could die. The world filled with the wounded and the aged and the ill, all of them unable to cross the threshold they had reached. Ares, the war god, found his battles producing only suffering and no resolution, no clean dead falling on his fields, only men who could not finish dying. Ares freed Thanatos, and Sisyphus was brought to the underworld. But Sisyphus had prepared for this. Before his death, the sources tell, he had instructed his wife to perform none of the funeral rites, no offerings, no coins for the ferryman, no proper burial. He arrived in the underworld as a shade without the correct preparation, and he went to Persephone and made his appeal directly. His wife had failed in her duties. He had not been properly honored. He needed to return to the world above, just briefly, just long enough to punish his wife for her negligence and arrange the correct rites. Persephone, or perhaps Hades himself, in some versions of the telling, granted the request. Sisyphus returned to the living world, to his city and his palace and the warm air of the upper regions, and he simply did not go back. He lived for some additional years. The tradition is not precise about the number, enjoying the particular satisfaction of a man who has talked his way out of death twice. When he finally died of age, he was brought back to the underworld with rather less ceremony, and the sentence was waiting for him: a boulder, a hill, and the instruction to push the first to the top of the second, and to keep doing so. The hill in Tartarus where Sisyphus works is of no particular height. The tradition does not say it is immense or impossible in its dimensions. It is simply a slope steep enough to require effort, with a summit near enough to be visible from below. This nearness is precise. The boulder does not stop at the base of the hill and leave the summit somewhere beyond sight. It stops within reach of the top, at the place where completion seems most credible, where the last few feet of slope are in full view. It stops there, and then it returns. The philosopher Albert Camus, writing in the 20th century, used Sisyphus as the image for what he called the absurd condition, the experience of a consciousness that desires meaning and finds only indifference, that pushes its stone regardless and must be imagined, as he wrote, happy. That reading belongs to Camus, and it is one reading among several that the image has generated across centuries of encounter with it. Homer was not writing philosophy. He was describing what Odysseus saw: a man, a stone, a hill, an effort, a failure, the effort beginning again. The image offers itself to interpretation because it is so structurally clean, the components so few, the repetition so total, the gap between the achievement and its reversal so precise. What the boulder looks like when it rolls back is not something Homer describes at length. He does not say it crashes or thunders down the hillside. The Odyssey gives it a single verb. It rolls back to the plain. It arrives at the bottom. It rests there exactly where it started, entirely still, with the complete indifference of stone, that has no opinion about where it is or how many times it has traveled this particular slope. Sisyphus descends to where it rests. He puts his hands against it. He pushes. Some versions of the tradition include a detail that alters the texture of the image somewhat. The stone in those accounts is not merely a large rock. It is described as having been specifically fitted to the task, a stone of the right size and the right weight to require a single man's full effort over the full distance of the slope. The boulder of Sisyphus is, on this reading, a custom object, a product of the same deliberate design that placed Tantalus in his pool with his fruit and his water. The punishment does not randomly exceed or fall short of the man's capacity. It is calibrated. It requires everything, precisely, with nothing left over and nothing held in reserve. Whether the tradition holds that Sisyphus knows the boulder will not stay at the summit, whether he understands the structure of his sentence, or pushes each time with some remnant of hope that this time the stone will remain is something the sources do not resolve. Homer does not enter Sisyphus's experience. He watches from outside, as Odysseus does, and reports the action. The boulder goes up, the boulder comes back, the man goes down to the plain. These are the facts of the scene, and the scene has been there in that text for nearly 3,000 years, and the stone is still there on the plain in Tartarus, waiting for the next ascent. Beyond the hill, further still, into the bronze-walled dark, there is light. It is not the light of the sun, or of any ordinary fire. It comes from a wheel, large, slowly turning, its rim ablaze, casting an orange glow that slides across the walls around it in a long, unbroken ring. Suspended on the wheel, turning with it as it turns, is a man. His name is Ixion. Ixion, in the tradition, was a king of the Lapiths, a people of northern Greece. He had arranged to marry and had promised a great bride price to the father of his intended, and then, after the marriage, he had refused to pay. The father came to claim what was owed, and Ixion murdered him, pushed him into a pit of burning coals, the sources say, which makes the wheel of fire in Tartarus carry its own quiet symmetry. No one would purify Ixion of this murder. The act of killing a relative by marriage was considered a contamination, a pollution, and the rituals that would have restored him to clean standing required a host willing to perform them. No mortal king would do it. Zeus purified him.
This is the part of the story that the tradition finds most significant. Not the original murder, which was terrible enough, but what Ixion did after being restored to good standing by the highest of the Olympian gods, invited to dine on Olympus itself, given ambrosia and a seat at the divine table. He looked at Hera, the wife of Zeus, and desired her. He made an attempt.
Exactly how far the attempt progressed before Zeus intervened is something different sources handle differently. But Zeus's response was to fashion a cloud, a nephilah, in Greek, shaped exactly like Hera, and to set it before Ixion to see what he would do with it. Ixion coupled with the cloud took on something of what had happened to it. From the union of Ixion and the cloud shaped like Hera came the first of the centaurs, or in some accounts, the ancestor from whom the centaurs descended, those creatures of the tradition who are man above the waist and horse below, who appear across Greek myth as figures of unruly appetite and force, neither fully within the order of human civilization, nor entirely outside it. They carry in their bodies the double nature of their origin, something divine adjacent above, something animal below, born from a delusion about an object that was never what it appeared to be. Zeus bound Ixion and sent him to Tartarus, and the wheel was his sentence. The tradition describes it as a great wheel, and it is on fire, and it turns without stopping, and Ixion is bound to its rim. In some accounts, the wheel is said to turn in the air rather than on the ground, suspended, spinning, not attached to any axle that rests on anything solid. The fire of the wheel does not consume it. The fire does not consume Ixion. The wheel simply turns, and the fire simply burns, and the light it casts moves around the bronze walls of Tartarus in a slow, continuous ring that has been circling those walls since Ixion arrived. Looking at the three punishments together, not to rank them or to extract a lesson, the tradition does not explicitly offer, but simply to observe their structure. What stands out is the quality of precision in each design. Tantalus sinned at a table and was placed at a table. He committed excess in the presence of gods who had admitted him to their company, and he was placed in the company of everything he needed and denied access to all of it. The punishment reflects the crime in the way a mirror reflects a face, the same elements, the same orientation, but something fundamentally reversed. Sisyphus crossed the boundary between life and death. Twice, and by his own will, and through his own cleverness. His punishment is boundaryless in its own way. The summit he will never reach is the boundary of his labor, and it perpetually recedes, so that the man who spent his life refusing the final limit finds himself assigned an effort that has no completion. The stone rolls back from the summit each time. The end of the task is always visible and never available. Ixion desired something that was not what it appeared to be, and did not discover his error until after the act. His wheel turns in air with nothing at its center, a circular motion that returns perpetually to where it began and produces nothing, going neither forward nor inward nor outward, only around. The crime was a mistake about identity, a failure to perceive what was real, and the sentence is a structure that encloses nothing, a shape complete in itself and absolutely empty at its core. None of this means that the tradition designed these punishments as explicit logical riddles, or that every ancient Greek reader understood them as encoded messages about the nature of the crimes they follow. The sources do not explain the connection. They describe the crime, and then they describe the punishment, and the connection between them is simply there, present in the structure, available to anyone who looks at the two things side by side long enough to notice the shape. What Odysseus sees in the underworld, standing at his trench in the dark, is a series of images. He does not receive explanations. He looks across the dim space, and there is Tantalus reaching. There is Sisyphus pushing. There is, presumably, though the Odyssey's account concentrates on Tantalus and Sisyphus most directly, the wider geography of that deep place, its walls and its distances, and the specific arrangements of punishment that have been going on since before any living person was born. And that will go on after every living person has themselves made the crossing into the underworld and been assigned to whatever part of it fits them. The tradition accumulated these figures over a long time. Tantalus appears in sources that are among the oldest in the Greek literary inheritance. Sisyphus appears in Homer himself, which places him in the 8th century BCE. Ixion appears in Pindar in the early 5th century BCE, in a form that already treats his story as well established, something the audience will recognize, something that does not require introduction. These are old stories. The characters in them were not invented for Tartarus. They were kings and figures of mortal myth who collected crimes across their lifetimes and ended in the same deep place. The tradition simply put them there, one by one over the centuries, until Tartarus had its permanent residence. Each of them had been, before their sentence, a man of some distinction. Tantalus was a son of Zeus. Sisyphus was renowned across the ancient world for cleverness above any other mortal. Ixion was a king who had been purified by the highest god and given a seat in the divine hall. The crimes that landed each of them in Tartarus are not the crimes of small people without resources. They are crimes of ambition and excess and transgression against limits that were supposed to be absolute, the limit of what a guest owes a host, the limit of life and death, the limit between mortal and divine. The tradition seems to be interested in exactly this, in what happens when someone who has been given extraordinary proximity to the sacred abuses it in the most extreme way available to them. Tartarus, on this reading, is not simply a prison for the wicked. It is a specific address for a specific kind of crime, the crime of being given access to something rare and using that access to transgress against the deepest structures of the world. The pool of Tantalus is still in the dark below everything. The water is still there, real and clear and cold, rising to the chin of the figure who stands in it. The fruit is still there, hanging on its branches, in the colors of things that are fully ripe and will never fall. Tantalus is still reaching, or has just lowered his hand, or is about to reach again. The pool is quiet. In the deep geography of Tartarus, below the triple night and the bronze fence, below the roots of the earth, below the layered dark, the pool simply continues. The hill of Sisyphus is also there, in that same wide dark valley. The stone is on the plain again, resting with its full and indifferent weight in the same position it always returns to. Sisyphus has descended from the upper slope and arrived at where the stone sits, and his hands are on it, or about to be on it, or he is still walking down with the stone somewhere above him, still rolling. The hill is exactly the height it has always been. The summit is exactly as close as it always is. The work is about to begin again, and Ixion's wheel turns in the dark between the walls, casting its ring of firelight, the only moving source of illumination in a place that is otherwise still. The wheel does not slow. The fire does not dim. The light moves along the bronze walls in a slow, continuous arc, reaching one point and then another and then another, completing its circuit and beginning the next one, the rotation as regular and unhurried as something that has forgotten it was ever meant to stop. The three punishments have been happening for as long as the tradition has been placing them in Tartarus, which is to say, for a very long time. Before the philosophers wrote about the judgment of souls, before the Roman poets inherited the Greek stories and restated them in Latin, before the medieval scholars tried to make sense of what they found in those texts. Before all of that, in the oldest layers of the tradition, there was a pool and a hill and a wheel and three men assigned to their specific structures and the deep dark of the pit surrounding all of it. What is particular about these punishments, what makes them available to contemplation rather than just to horror, is that they are not chaotic. They do not consist of random pain or arbitrary torment. Each of them has a form. The form is legible. The pool has its cycle of approach and retreat. The hill has its slope and its summit and its plane. The wheel has its circumference and its rotation. These are structures. They are organized. They have a geometry that can be observed from a sufficient distance, the way Odysseus observed them, without descending into the experience of the person inside the structure. The observation can be as calm and as interested as the observation of anything very old and very carefully made. Tartarus holds them. The bronze walls are at their distance. The triple night is above. The roots of the earth pass through the layers of the cosmos and terminate somewhere in the deepest dark, and the three structures continue their work in the dark below the roots, below everything, at the bottom of the vertical hierarchy that the tradition arranged, from the warm surface of the living world, down through the gray reaches of the underworld, and then further still, further than the 9-day fall of a bronze anvil can reach, to this place where the oldest punishments are still going about their business. The pool, and the fruit, and the stone, and the hill, and the wheel of fire, these are the furniture of a very old room, in a very old building, at the bottom of a cosmos that the Greeks began imagining before the writing of their oldest surviving texts, and that they kept imagining across centuries, adding details, adding figures, adjusting the geography, filling in the bronze walls, and the rivers, and the gates, and the guardians, and the judges. The tradition was never finished. It accumulated. Each generation found something in it to add or to adjust, and the whole structure grew slowly larger and more intricate, the way a building grows when each generation adds a room. Ixion's wheel turns. The light it casts is the only moving thing in the still, enormous dark. It catches the bronze of the walls and slides along them, orange and slow, reaching one point and then another, the fire steady on the rim. the rotation as even as water moving through a channel that has been worn into stone over a very long time. The wheel is the image Tartarus leaves with the mind most readily, not because it is the most extreme or the most terrible, but because it is the most visible. It generates its own light. It turns in the dark and makes the dark measurable, gives it a circumference, a surface to illuminate, a shape. The punishments have their geometry. The geometry is old. Somewhere in the deep dark, in the bronze-fenced pit below the triple night, below the roots of the world, the three structures are doing what they have always done, quietly and without interruption, each one carrying its own particular logic, each one a mirror of the crime that brought someone to this specific address in the deepest place the Greek imagination could locate. Ixion's wheel turns steadily. The light it throws moves around the walls at its own unhurried pace, never faster and never slower, completing its circuit and beginning the next one, the fire calm and continuous against the bronze, casting its ring of illumination outward into the dark and inward toward the still center of the wheel, where there is nothing, only air, and the steady turning, and the ancient geometry of a punishment that has found its form and is simply, quietly going about it. In the gray country that Homer describes below the living world, there is a figure holding a golden scepter. The dead press around him, not in chaos, but in the manner of those who have learned to wait, who have arrived at a place where waiting is no longer a burden, because there is nowhere else to be. He listens, he deliberates, he gives his judgment, and the souls move on from him toward the paths that divide the underworld into its different destinations. His name is Minos, and Homer places him in this position in the 11th book of the Odyssey, in the account of Odysseus descending to the edge of the dead to seek the counsel of the prophet Tiresias. Odysseus does not speak to Minos. He watches him from a distance, as a traveler might watch a court in session in a foreign city, observing the procedure, taking in the weight of the golden scepter, noting the patience with which the figure holds it. The scepter is a specific detail, and Homer gives it deliberately. It is the sign of a king's authority carried into death, and continuing to function there, as though the work of governance did not end when the governor did, but simply moved to a deeper room. Minos was a king of Crete in the world of the living. He was a son of Zeus and Europa, and during his life the tradition held him to be a figure of exceptional legal intelligence, a lawgiver whose judgments were renowned across the Greek world for their fairness and their precision. Plato draws on this reputation in several of his dialogues, treating Minos as the model of what a judge ought to be. In the Mythology, the life of a lawgiver made him, in death, the most natural candidate for the senior position in the Underworld court, the one whose authority over the dead extended farthest, and whose deliberations carried the most weight. What Homer shows Odysseus watching is not the beginning of something. It is a court that has been sitting for a very long time, that knows exactly what it is doing, whose procedures have settled into something as regular and as practiced as any earthly institution that has been functioning long enough to have worn smooth all of its surfaces. Beside Minos, and in other accounts before him, at the crossroads of the underworld, sit two other judges, whose names the tradition preserves with care. Rhadamanthus is the first. He too was a son of Zeus and Europa, a brother of Minos, and in the mythology of the living world, he was associated above all with justice, with the specific quality of impartiality that makes a judgment reliable. In the division of responsibilities described in Plato's Gorgias, Rhadamanthus receives the souls of those who came from Asia, evaluating them at the crossroads where the paths of the underworld diverge. The Gorgias is a dialogue concerned with the nature of justice and the question of whether it is better to suffer wrongdoing or to commit it. And Plato reaches at the end of that dialogue for the mythology of the underworld court as the clearest image he can find of judgment operating without distortion. Rhadamanthus in that account embodies the ideal, a judge so associated with impartiality that his name in later European traditions became an adjective for it. To call a decision Rhadamanthine was to say that it had the particular quality of a verdict given without favor, without the interference of appearances, without any purchase for argument, except the argument that is true. Appius is the third. He was a son of Zeus and the nymph Agagina, and in his life he was a king whose reputation for piety and justice was said to have been so considerable that after his death Zeus appointed him to stand beside his brothers in the underworld court. In Plato's Gorgias, Aeacus receives the souls from Europe, as Rhadamanthus receives those from Asia, and Minos presides over both with his golden scepter. Some sources give Aeacus an additional responsibility that makes his position in the court particularly specific and particular. He holds the keys to Tartarus itself, not only the authority to deliver a verdict, but the physical means of executing it. The key is a detail that the myth preserves as though it matters, because it does. It makes the whole judicial architecture of the underworld tangible in a way that abstract descriptions of justice do not. A court that delivers verdicts is one thing. A court where the judge who pronounces the deepest sentence also holds the key to the door is another, the power and the consequence held together in the same hands, the verdict and the lock belonging to the same figure, standing in the gray light of the underworld meadow. The meadow is where Plato's account of the judgment most fully comes into focus. In the Gorgias, the crossroads is set in an open space, a field, a meadow, the kind of place that has the quality of being nowhere in particular, and very specifically itself at the same time. 3 paths diverge from it. One path leads to the Elysian fields, where the souls of those who lived well in the ordinary sense of a good human life are sent to dwell in a country described as pleasant, as peaceful, as having the quality of a very long afternoon that does not end. Another path leads to the Isles of the Blessed, a destination reserved, in some accounts, for those who have achieved virtue, not just once, but across multiple lives, who have returned to the world of the living and chosen well each time, and whose accumulated character has earned them a place in the most fortunate of the underworld's regions. The third path descends. It goes down through the underworld, past the geography of shade and river and gray air, down toward the bronze walls and the triple darkness and the enormous gates that mark the boundary of Tartarus. The paths are described as simply being there, as roads are simply there, worn into the ground by use, running in their directions with the matter-of-fact purposefulness of routes that have been taken countless times by countless travelers who did not choose which one they were going to take. The souls who arrive at the crossroads in Plato's account have been prepared for judgment in a specific way. They arrive stripped of their bodies. This is not a violent or sudden deprivation. It is in the logic of the Gorgias, the natural condition of the soul once it has departed the living world, but it is also a condition that Plato treats as essential to the integrity of the judgment. In life, the body provides cover. It can be beautiful or imposing, well-dressed or well-fed, carrying in its appearance all the signals of wealth and rank and social position that cause human beings, in their ordinary dealings with each other, to make assessments that have nothing to do with actual character. The judges in the underworld, in Plato's account, suffered from exactly this problem when they were still alive. They were asked to evaluate souls while both parties, judge and soul, still wore their bodies, and the result was that beautiful or physically impressive people received verdicts more favorable than their actual lives had earned. Zeus corrected this. He ruled that souls must arrive at judgment after the body has been removed, standing in the underworld meadow in nothing but the shape of the lives they lived, the choices they made, the things they did or failed to do, the quality of the character they cultivated from the materials that were available to them. What remains of a soul in that condition is described in the Gorgias in a way that is quietly exact. A soul that lived well in the deepest sense, that cultivated honesty and fairness and genuine care for others, not only in its public actions, but in its private ones, not only when it was observed, but when it was not, arrives at the crossroads, carrying something that Plato's account associates with an almost physical beauty, an orderliness, a shape that the judges can read as clearly as a text written in a language they have always known. A soul that did not live this way arrives differently. The marks of its choices are visible on it, not as wounds precisely, but as distortions, as the evidence of a life lived in a particular direction, toward particular ends, with particular effects on the people and circumstances around it. The judges read these as anyone reads a surface that has been marked by time and use, with the particular fluency that comes from having read thousands of such surfaces and learned what each kind of marking means. In the meadow, the judgment happens without ceremony. This is one of the things that makes Plato's account of the underworld court feel different from what one might expect of a final reckoning. There is no spectacle, no performance, no elaborate ritual of weighing or testing or transformation. The soul stands at the crossroads. The judges look at it, they deliberate, they give their verdict. The soul moves toward one of the three paths, and the next soul takes its place at the crossroads, and the work continues. It continues, in the account as it must, because the dead keep arriving, as they always have, as they always will, in the numbers that the living world continually produces, and the court accommodates them all with the same unhurried attention it has given to every soul that has come before. Rhadamanthus, in his seat at the crossroads, is described in Plato's account as someone who works quickly and accurately. He examines the soul from Asia that stands before him. He looks at the marks on it with the attentiveness of someone who has been doing this for longer than any single life can measure, and has developed, in that time, a fluency with the evidence that requires no deliberation in the ordinary sense. He sees what the soul carried here from the life it lived. He gives his verdict. The soul moves on. He turns to the next. This is the rhythm of the work, particular, precise, without excess. In the mythology, Rhadamanthus does not punish anyone himself. He reads the evidence and delivers the judgment, and the soul then goes where the verdict directs it. The verb is always read and evaluate, never condemn or reward. The justice is in the accuracy of the reading, not in the emotion behind it. Plato's Socrates in the Gorgias returns to the image of the underworld court more than once in the course of the dialogue, and the reason becomes clear as the conversation develops. The dialogue is concerned with what justice actually is, whether it is merely the outcome of power or whether it has a structure that exists independent of who is currently in a position to enforce it. The underworld court serves, in the Socratic argument, as the clearest possible image of the second kind of justice, a judgment from which there is no appeal, not because the judges are tyrannical, but because the evidence cannot be falsified. There is nothing to bribe. There is nothing to present that is not there. The soul in the meadow at the crossroads is what it is, and the judge reads it and gives the verdict that the soul's own life has already in effect written. There is something in this account that is worth sitting with, the notion that the soul, in arriving at the crossroads, is not being evaluated by something external to it, so much as it is being seen. The judgment is not being imposed from outside in the manner of a sentence handed down from above. The soul is standing in a place where, for the first time, the thing it actually is can be fully perceived, where the body is no longer there to mediate, to soften, to complicate the image. What the judges see is the soul's own interior, as it accumulated over the course of a life, held up now in the gray light of the meadow crossroads with nothing around it. The verdict follows from the reading as naturally as a description follows from observation. The path the soul takes next is the path its life, in the fullest sense, was already moving toward. For the soul's moving toward the Elysian fields, the path runs through a country the tradition describes in terms of warmth and ease and long afternoons of conversation with others who are also at rest. It is a destination that appears in Homer and Hesiod and in later sources, shifting in its details from account to account, but holding across all of them a consistent quality, the sense of arriving somewhere that is genuinely pleasant, not as a reward in the transactional sense, but as the natural condition of a soul whose time in the living world was spent in a particular direction. The Elysian fields are not celebrated or excessive. They are simply good in the way that a thing is good, when it is what it is supposed to be, when it fits the shape of what is needed, without surplus and without deficiency. The Isles of the Blessed are further and reserved for fewer. Pindar, the 5th century BCE lyric poet, describes them in his second Olympian ode as an island out in the ocean where Kronos rules and the souls of the philosophically and morally virtuous dwell in a country of perpetual ease. The wind from the ocean comes off the water. The flowers are made of gold. The shade of old trees falls across the ground. It is an image so specific and so quiet that it stays in the mind long after the details of the argument around it have receded. Pindar's account places Achilles on the Isles of the Blessed, and Peleus and Cadmus, heroes and kings who earned, across the full account of their lives, the most fortunate destination the underworld offers. In some accounts, these souls have lived and been judged multiple times, have returned to the world of the living across several existences, and chosen well in each of them, so that the Isles of the Blessed are not merely a reward for a single good life, but the accumulated result of a particular sustained orientation across more than one. The path into Tartarus is described in none of the ancient accounts as a long one, in the sense of requiring great endurance. The descent is swift once the verdict has been given. What makes Tartarus what it is, in the full account the mythology preserves, is not the journey down to it, but the arriving, and what waits there. The bronze walls are there. The triple darkness is layered over everything. The hecatonchires are at their post at the gates. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, the 100-handed giants who have stood at their station since the end of the war that settled the shape of the current cosmos, their 100 arms hanging at rest in the layered dark, their 50 heads oriented toward the doors they were placed here to guard. The Titans are inside. The walls are the same walls they have always been. The darkness is the same darkness. A soul descending toward Tartarus passes through all the geography the underworld contains above it. The rivers are there in the depths. The Styx, which rises in Hesiod's account from the abyss of Tartarus itself, carrying the cold weight of its oath-binding authority upward through the underworld and outward to the world where gods still swear by it. The Phlegethon runs with its particular quality of light, the river of fire, whose brightness in the underworld darkness has nothing to do with warmth and nothing to do with comfort, but is simply a feature of the geography. as a river in the living world is a feature of the landscape it runs through, indifferent to the travelers who cross it. The Cocytus, the river of lamentation, moves through its course with its characteristic sound, which is not louder in some places than others, but simply present, a continuous feature of the underworld's acoustic texture, as the sound of water is a continuous feature of a country where water moves. None of these features of the underworld are arranged for the benefit of the souls who pass through them. They are arranged in the way the cosmos arranged itself at the beginning, Tartarus at the bottom, then the underworld above it, then the living world above that, each layer occupying its position in the vertical hierarchy that Hesiod's cosmology establishes from the earliest chapters of the Theogony. The rivers run because they have always run. The darkness is layered over Tartarus because it has been layered there since before the Titans were imprisoned. The roots of the earth extend downward through all of it and terminate somewhere in the abyss, anchoring the living surface of the world from below. The structure is not punitive in itself. It simply is, as a mountain is what it is, as the ocean is what it is, without intention toward the travelers who move through it. Athacus, holding the keys to Tartarus, is the figure who connects the judicial process at the crossroads to the physical architecture of the prison below. There is something in the detail of the key, its weight, its specificity, the way it is a real object in the myth, rather than a symbol or a metaphor, that makes the relationship between judgment and consequence feel grounded in the mythology in a way that purely abstract accounts of justice do not achieve. When Athacus delivers a verdict that sends a soul toward Tartarus, he is not only pronouncing a judgment, he holds in the same hands that sign off on the verdict the instrument that opens the door. The authority is complete and continuous from the evaluation at the crossroads to the turning of the key at the bronze gates below. The Gorgias describes the souls who go to Tartarus as those whose lives were lived in the deepest opposition to the kind of character the judges are trained to read as orderly and good, not those who made ordinary human errors, who were weak in ordinary ways, who failed in the particular small failures that a life of genuine effort nonetheless accumulates over time. Plato is careful in this account to distinguish between those who can still be corrected, who have lived badly enough to require suffering, but not so badly that the suffering cannot produce a genuine change, and those who cannot. The second category is the one Tartarus receives. These are souls whose lives were shaped by a fundamental orientation away from the good, who had, in Plato's framing, the intelligence to know what they were doing and the power to do it anyway, and who chose again and again, across the full length of a life, to use that intelligence and that power for the wrong ends. The Gorgias names a category of soul that goes to Tartarus and is released after a period, reformed, changed, improved by what it experienced there. And it names another category that does not leave. These souls remain, and in the Platonic account, they serve a purpose even in their remaining. Other souls in Tartarus observe them. The permanence of their condition is itself a feature of the geography, a visible demonstration for the souls who will eventually be released of what a life lived in that deepest wrong direction accumulates into over time. They are not described as being watched from above, as examples offered to the living. They exist in Tartarus as a permanent feature of it, as the bronze walls are a permanent feature of it, as the triple darkness is permanent, as the hecaton chairs at the gates are permanent. In some ancient accounts, the geography of judgment is described from the perspective of the soul arriving at the crossroads, rather than from the perspective of the judges presiding over it. The soul approaches the meadow after passing through the outer regions of the underworld, after the crossing of the rivers, after the gray country where the shades of the ordinary dead exist in their particular twilight condition, after whatever transitional geography separates the recently arrived from the established inhabitants of the realm. It arrives at the crossroads without the body it spent its life inside. Everything that the body provided, its particular way of moving through the world, its face and height, and the impression it made on others, the social position it carried, the wealth or poverty visible in its clothing and bearing, all of that is gone. What remains is what was always there beneath it, accumulated over the years that the life lasted, shaped by every choice that was made in it. Minos, at his post with the golden scepter, has seen an immeasurable number of these. The court has been in session since the beginning of the current arrangement of the cosmos, since the bronze gates of Tartarus were sealed behind the Titans, and the cosmos settled into the shape it has maintained since then. Every human death in every generation since that settling has eventually produced a soul that arrived at the crossroads in the underworld meadow. The judges have read them all. The scepter has been held throughout. The three paths have been receiving their traffic continuously, in proportions that the mythology does not specify, but that the tradition implies, are neither simple nor predictable, that the distribution of souls across the three destinations reflects the full variety of the lives the living world produces, which is a variety the tradition has always treated as irreducible to any simple formula. In the Odyssey, Odysseus watches Minos for only a moment before the press of souls and the urgency of his own errand carry him on through the underworld. He is not there to be judged. He is still alive, still carrying his body into this country where bodies do not belong, and his presence is anomalous in exactly the way the tradition treats it. Remarkable, observed, but not permanent. He will go back. He goes back. And Minos stays at his post with the golden scepter, the dead still arriving, the judgments still being given, the paths still running in their three directions from the crossroads in the meadow, because this is what the court does. It does not pause while Odysseus is watching. It does not pause when he leaves. It continues in the way that a river continues, in the way that the roots of the earth continue to descend through the underworld toward the abyss, in the way that the bronze walls of Tartarus have been standing since they were first raised and will continue to stand for as long as the cosmos maintains its current arrangement. There is a quality to the underworld court, as the ancient sources describe it from different angles and through different kinds of attention, that is most easily felt in the aggregate, in holding all of the details together at once, rather than examining any single one of them in isolation. Minos with the scepter, Rhadamanthus reading a soul with the fluency of long practice, Acus holding the keys and pronouncing his verdicts on the souls from Europe, the meadow crossroads with its three paths, the grass quiet, and the souls arriving in their stripped condition, the path descending toward Tartarus, the bronze walls at the bottom, the triple darkness, the hecatonchires at the gate, the Styx flowing upward from the abyss with its oath-binding cold, the phlegeton with its river light that illuminates without warming, the judges still seated at their posts after all this time, the work still going on, the dead still coming. What the tradition is describing across all of these accounts and images and specific details is not a place of punishment, in the sense that punishment is usually understood as something imposed, as something suffered, as something the punished figure resists or resents, or endures with the hope of its ending. What the tradition is describing is a system, a structure, something that has the particular quality of things that have been in place long enough that they no longer require maintenance, that have achieved a kind of self-sustaining equilibrium in which each element holds its position and fulfills its function, and the whole operates with the smooth, unhurried continuity of a mechanism that was well designed to begin with and has been running without interruption ever since. Plato, across several dialogues, returns to the imagery of the underworld court with the attentiveness of someone who genuinely finds it useful, not as a rhetorical device for frightening an audience into good behavior, but as the clearest image available for what perfect judgment looks like when it operates without the distortions that judgment in the living world is always subject to. The bodies removed, the evidence visible in its undistorted form, the judges trained by long experience in reading exactly this kind of evidence, the verdicts given without appeal, not because the system is cruel, but because the reading is accurate. For Plato, the underworld court is what justice looks like when everything that prevents justice in the ordinary world has been removed. It is not an ideal in the sense of something that does not exist. It is, in the tradition's account, what actually happens to souls after the life is over. But it is also, in Plato's use of it, a model for thinking about what judgment would look like if it were given the conditions it requires. The Styx flows upward through all of this. It rises from the abyss of Tartarus, and the gods of Olympus swear their most binding oaths by it. And when they do, Iris descends to the underworld with a golden jug and draws water from the river to carry back to Olympus for the oath-swearing ceremony. This detail, which Hesiod preserves in the Theogony, is one of the small connective tissues of the mythology, a thread that runs from the deepest place in the cosmos all the way to the summit of Olympus, linking the abyss to the divine authority of the gods who rule the living world. The Styx's authority to bind oaths derives from its source. The water that makes an oath unbreakable comes from the same place where the Titans are imprisoned, behind the same bronze walls, beneath the same triple darkness. The most solemn instrument of divine governance reaches its authority from Tartarus, the oldest and deepest and most foundational element of the cosmos. This is what the ancient sources, read together, gradually reveal about Tartarus, that its position at the bottom of everything is not incidental to its function, but essential to it. A prison needs to be somewhere that cannot be escaped from. A foundation needs to be at the bottom, a source of absolute authority, of oath-binding water, of the walls that hold what must be held, needs to be rooted in something that was there before nearly everything else, that has the particular permanence of things that emerged at the beginning of the cosmos and have not moved since. Tartarus is all of these things at once, as Hesiod makes clear in the Theogony, a deity and a place, a prison and a foundation, a geographical feature of the cosmos, and a generative force that produced in union with Gaia the last and greatest challenge to the Olympian order. Its depth is not a metaphor, its darkness is not symbolic. The bronze walls are bronze, the triple night is layered night. The roots of the earth terminate there and hold the living surface of the world in place from below.